Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This week, the Daily Mail came out with this front page. They're very, very unhappy with the House of Lords. They say it's time to pull the plug on the Lords, and up here they call them traitors in ermine. It's because of those 14 defeats on the Brexit bill. In the Commons, Brexiteers are absolutely furious. Case for the prosecution is this. This is from David Davis in 2012, a humble backbencher back then, but now Brexit Secretary. And back then he says the plan to reform the House of Lords is a threat to this unique check on excessive power. Well, unique is now becoming a bit annoying. Now, we thought we would look back on that time when they were trying to reform the House of Lords and look at all the people who rode to the defence of the Lords and forced David Cameron to drop his plans. Here we have a bewildering number of names and people, and we've divided them up into 4 sections. You've got Labour Leave, Labour Remain, Conservative Remain, but the most important block is down here. These are Tories who went on to vote Leave, I just will pick some out for you. You've got David Davis, who you just heard. We've got our friend over there, John Whittingdale. And then up here, Jacob Rees-Mogg. All of these opposed to House of Lords reform, but these in particular are now Brexiteers. Now, this morning, Jacob Rees-Mogg in The Sun on Sunday said that there will be fundamental questions about Lords reform, and it will come up again if they continue to oppose Brexit, or as he puts it, they are setting the peers against the people.
So I'm delighted to be joined by Natalie Evans, Leader of the House of Lords. Natalie, this issue of whether your colleagues, in a sense, broke the conventions by voting for these amendments, such as, you know, taking out of the bill the date we're leaving the EU, saying that we should remain in the European Economic Area and the single market. Jacob Rees-Mogg says you've all misbehaved. Have you?
Well, I don't think that these wreck the bill as such, but I certainly think some of them do undermine Brexit, and I'm disappointed that a number of these amendments went through. But look, the Lords is a revising...
Traitors in ermine? Would you agree with the Daily Mail?
I wouldn't use those words, no, and I don't think you'd expect me to as Leader of the Lords. As I say, we play an important scrutinising and revising role. I do think in some of these areas we did go too far, and in fact the amendments had nothing to do with the bill, which is in fact about making sure we have a proper functioning legal system when we leave. But look, our role is to ask the Commons to think again. We've now handed these amendments over to the Commons, or in fact we will do after the bill gets through the Lords on Wednesday, and it is for them now to decide. But what I think is very important, what peers across the House, including the Leader of the Labour Party and the Lords, have said, is that if the Commons say, thank you, House of Lords, but no, we're going to stick with what we thought in the first place, that the Lords accept the primacy of the elected House, and I thoroughly expect them to do so.
So just to be clear, what would represent, in your view, a tearing up at the conventions that Lords do not essentially attack the will of the government, as it were, would be if the Lords came back second time round and insisted on these amendments? Well,
as I've said, we've now asked the Commons to think again. We've had strong support across the House of Lords with peers who have supported some of these amendments that, as I've said, I was disappointed about, saying that they accept the primacy of the elected House, and that is what I thoroughly expect us to do. They've done some scrutinising and revising. On many issues, we've actually worked very constructively together, and we've made some important changes to improve the bill. But it's now the time of the Commons to think about these, and I fully expect the Lords to respect the will of the House of Commons and indeed the people who obviously voted to leave in the referendum.
Some of your senior Tory colleagues say that because of the way the Lords have behaved, the issue of reform of the House of Lords has to come back on the agenda.
Well, we've been quite clear that reform of the Lords isn't a huge priority at the moment, so I think we're probably telling we've got a lot on as a government at the moment, and that isn't a priority. But of course there are issues with the House of Lords that we recognise, particularly around its size, which is something the public are concerned about, and indeed my colleagues in the Lords are. So we're continuing to look at how we can decrease the size of the Lords. But we're focused on...
no reform in terms of the powers of the Lords anytime soon?
Well, as we've said, it's not a priority, and I fully expect the Lords to listen to the will of the Commons. Obviously, during Article 50, we had similar arguments about the Lords thwarting the will of the people, but we pass the bill as the Prime Minister and indeed the government wanted to, and I expect that the Lords will respect the Commons in this instance as well.
How embarrassed were you last week as a member of the Cabinet when the Prime Minister was unable multiple times to answer Jeremy Corbyn's questions about what kind of customs proposal we'd be putting to Brussels?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's been very clear about the principles that underline our approach, and as you and everyone knows, there are two options on the table which are now being looked at in more detail. I think we'd have been criticised quite rightly for rushing into a plan that didn't work. It is obviously a challenging and complicated area, and we want to get it right because it's critical to our future.
Which of the two proposals do you favour?
Well, as I've said, work is still ongoing on them, so they are at a point still a movable feast. I will make my views known when they're presented to the Cabinet.
Do you have a view?
And give my views. Well, as I've said, I support the principles that underline what the Prime Minister said. We want frictionless trade. We want an independent trade policy, which I think is incredibly important and will be a big boost to our economic growth going forward. And, of course, we want to ensure that there's no hard border in Northern Ireland. There are two proposals on the table. My Cabinet colleagues are working on further details, and I will give my counsel on them once they've been finalised and they're brought to Cabinet.
I mean, your Tory colleague Nicky Morgan does not believe that what's called maximum facilitation, which is a sort of technological solution, can achieve any of the Prime Minister's, and you say you support them, any of the Prime Minister's ends, goals? Well,
I don't subscribe to the position that Nicky set out, but she's perfectly entitled to her opinion. As I've said, this is
so you do favour maximum facilitation?
No,
that appears to be what you just told me.
No. What I've said is that there are two proposals on the table that are being looked at. There are challenges with both, and we've been very honest about those, which is why further work's going on. And, of course, the EU are looking at their proposals as well. But what we will have is a good, strong negotiation, and it is in the interests of both the UK and the EU that we get this right. And the Prime Minister has shown, in terms of getting a withdrawal agreement, in terms of agreeing an implementation period, that we, this government and she, is capable of getting the right deal for this country, which is what we want.
Do you think it will be settled in the next week?
We shall have to see. I mean, there's work ongoing. I don't know what the timetable is for bringing discussions back to Cabinet, but what I can assure people is that we will get the right deal for this country, and this will be an important part of that.
Nicky Morgan, who was, of course, a member of the Cabinet, said that the rules of collective responsibility have been stretched to an extraordinary extent by the fact that, you know, the Foreign Secretary could say that one of these central customs plans is crazy and yet not be slapped down.
Well, as I've said, the full Cabinet, including Boris, support the approach the Prime Minister's taken. There are two proposals on the table.
Should he have been slapped down for those remarks?
It is entirely up to the Prime Minister how she wants to do.
Could you conceive of ever describing a government policy as crazy?
Well, as I've said, I support the approach that we've taken. There are two proposals on the table which we will look at, and people have got very strong views on this issue, as we've seen not only on this programme this morning, but we see regularly. And as I say, I will look forward to seeing and making a decision on those when they get put forward to Cabinet.
Natalie, so nice to see you again. Thank you for joining us. Good luck with keeping those Lords under control. I don't think it's a challenge most of us would like. And I'm now going to have a chat with my two esteemed guest leaders, Andy and John Whittingdale. John, I mean, it is a mess, this customs issue for the Prime Minister. You must have been embarrassed last week when she just simply couldn't spell out what kind of customs arrangement she wants.
Well, what we do know is our overall objectives, which is the ability to have trade agreements around the world, no longer to have to charge the goods coming into this country with the external tariff, which the EU insists upon, and the ability to set our own regulations. Those are some of the things why we decided to leave the European Union. Now, how we then reach an arrangement with our partners in Europe in terms of trading is something that is going to have to be negotiated. I don't like the customs partnership idea.
How cross will you be if somehow she gets that through the Cabinet?
Well, I just think it is incredibly complicated, and I find it very difficult to see how it can be made to work. And to some extent, I want to see trade agreements around the world, and it's quite difficult to say to trading partners, let's sign a trade agreement, but by the way, you're still going to have to pay the tariff and then go through this very complicated process of trying to get it back again. So I'd like to see the alternative looked at, which I'm delighted is now going to happen, what is called maximum facilitation. And I think that to some extent it will depend on the willingness on both sides to reach an agreement, because nobody benefits if we have to have complicated customs checks at our borders.
Lisa, Labour's in a mess as well, though, because, you know, although you've got a plan to be a part of a customs union, nonetheless, nobody really believes that solves the Irish border issue, which does require so-called regulatory alignment, membership of the single market, most people would say, and Labour's a million miles from that. And at the same token, your proposal that would not give the UK the ability to negotiate trade deals with the likes of America. So your position is equally unsustainable, isn't it?
Well, it's a pragmatic position, and I think...
Well, pragmatic but wrong, surely.
Well, no, the point is this, that the Prime Minister wrote an opinion piece this morning in which she set out a whole series of objectives, none of which can be achieved together under the options that she's currently considering. She's just not being honest. And the big missing bit of this, actually, is what happens on the island of Ireland, whether this means that you end up with a hard border or whether it means actually that you end up with a border within the United Kingdom. And there are trade-offs to all of these positions, but Labour's position, at least, is realistic. The problem with Max...
Well, it doesn't solve everything, but can I just ask you on this? Because, you know, many of your colleagues think the way to solve much of what you want to achieve would be for Britain to stay in the single market. So when this amendment comes back to the Commons for us to stay in the European Economic Area, will you vote for it?
Well, it depends what form you're asked to support it in. It would be absolutely wrong, in my view, to take that off the table, because if the meaningful vote that we're supposed to have on a deal, if that deal is a poor deal, then we ought to have other options available to us in Parliament and our reserve. I don't think it makes sense to...
Would you be prepared to defy a three-line whip? If Jeremy Corbyn said you've got to vote against the EEA, would you be prepared to defy him on that?
Well, in the end, I'll vote in the interests of my constituents and of the country, and it will depend very much on the deal that we end up with. The problem with this issue about the customs union, though, is that we've got a deadline looming. The European Council meets in June. They have said that we have to have at least moved towards resolving this issue by then, and if we haven't, what we've agreed so far may also be off the table at that point. So there is an urgency to this, and in the end, Theresa May is going to have to choose between two competing visions in her own cabinet.
There we go. That is the nub of it, John, isn't it? I mean, most of your colleagues say to me that the single most obvious approach that the Prime Minister has been taking has been to kick the can down the road to avoid these tough decisions. Can she continue to avoid this tough decision for much longer?
Well, it is correct that we're running out of time, but actually the way Europe works is that usually you reach agreement at the very last minute. That's what's happened before. So the fact that we're approaching a critical European Council, the chances are that we'll manage to find an agreement sort of in the middle of the night during that council meeting. I think that as long as there is a willingness on both sides, and plainly it is in everybody's interests to find a solution, then we can do so. And in terms of the Northern Ireland border, I've been out to Ireland with the Select Committee on Exiting the European Union. Nobody in Ireland wants to see a border reimposed, and actually Ireland has more to lose than anybody else.
Over there have profound doubts about whether a technological solution will work.
Well, we took evidence on the committee from the head of the HM Revenue and Customs. He said he could see no reason why it couldn't be made to work, and certainly it didn't require any hard border controls. And of course, the common travel area between Britain and Ireland has existed long before European Union, and therefore there is no question of people having to sort of show passports or go through checks. And most goods that trade do so on a very regular basis. These are
still big uncertainties, though. And unfortunately, I've got to draw you to a close because we've got to go to a break.